Welcome, everybody, to a very special presentation here at Ardwulf's Lair, associated with the Armchair Dragoons Digital Convention 2026. Joining me right now are Sam Buon, who is the president of the Georgetown University Wargames Society, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, a master's candidate in foreign services at Georgetown. And McLean is also a candidate for a master's degree in foreign services at Georgetown, and they're going to talk about the Korean War Armistice and their experience designing a game on it. So without further ado, I will hand it off to these gentlemen and disappear. If you have questions, there'll be Q&A at the end, so just note question as the first thing in your comment, and I will mark them for later perusal. So gentlemen, it's your show.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So we are going to be talking about the game that we designed over the course of a semester this past fall, A Bid for Peace, about the Korean War Armistice. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to give a quick introduction to why we were designing the war game in the first place. That's going to be in the class that we took, the limitations that kind of created and why we chose the Korean War in the first place. And then we'll be going into the kind of the development evolution of the game itself. Next slide, please.
So as previously mentioned, we're both students at Georgetown University in the Master's of Science in Foreign Service program. We took a course, War Game Design and Practice, taught by Andrew Olson this past semester. The course was designed to teach the fundamentals of wargaming and have a project resulting in a playable war game design at the end of the course. We played a wide variety of games as examples throughout the semester, engaged with other professionals, wargame professionals and designers throughout the course, and then had some playtesting, and it ended with a final presentation to outside playtesters from Department of State and elsewhere, where we presented the final product, which we'll be going over here.
So naturally, this classic room experience for the war game is going to create some limitations for our game. So from the outset, we knew that the game had to be playable and learnable and playable in under 2 hours. Then also the game itself had to be made in a 4-month period while we were taking 3 to 4 other classes at the same time. We also knew it had to be an educational war game rather than an analytic game where we were trying to study something. This is more about a teaching experience of something that we studied and want to teach our players about. Next slide, please. So why did we choose the Korean Armistice in the first place? There were kind of two avenues that mainly drew us to the Korean War Armistice. From my end, I was really interested in making something that was negotiation focused. I had some proposals to McLean and our partner Caitlin, who unfortunately could not make it today, that of a company and government relations game in the 1920s Middle East, oil companies, but and as we discussed that, we moved away towards other topics of interest for Caitlin and McLean, but that I wanted a thing that was focused on negotiation and this very important player-to-player interaction.
For my part, I was mostly interested in something that was not the traditional war game, not combat focused. My original idea was maybe something focusing on the aftermath of a conflict. And so we kind of settled in the middle a little bit, and are focusing more on the decision space around the negotiating table in the context of Korea and the Korean Armistice and the stalemate that had been produced on the battlefield at the time. The other thing we wanted to do to challenge ourselves and to learn a little bit more was just to pick a topic that none of us had a prior background in. And so those interests coalesced around the Korean War, both from the historical side and from the kind of mechanics that we wanted to get at, and fitting those two together.
A short note on some interest we found of the Korean War specifically, given that we didn't have prior background on it, was the complex political dynamics both between the negotiators and also kind of within a negotiating team. The part of, we were drawn to Korea after some discussion because it was as a proxy conflict between the U.S. and China, or U.S. and USSR. It was we had these high level political dynamics, but also the South Korea and North Korea were not simply vassal states of the larger powers, and so there were some interesting dynamics between the countries that we thought would be fun to explore. Next slide, please.
So now we'll move into kind of an overview of the game, and then we'll get into more of the nitty-gritty of the mechanics and how we chose them and how we designed them. So in the Korean War, we chose to focus on the main 4 state actors. So the Republic of Korea, the Democratic Republic of Korea, or North Korea, People's Republic of China, and then the United Nations as a whole. And in terms of the scenario, this takes place, as I mentioned earlier, kind of at the point of stalemate when negotiations have started on reaching an armistice. And the objective for these 4 players is to aim and reach an armistice that is more favorable to them than others. The way we modeled this in mechanical terms is every player will choose a nation to play and then choose one of 3, or rather draw one of 3 different priority cards, which you can see an example of here. There's one historical priority card, which reflects more of the historical, the actual historical record of what the countries were more focused on. And then there are 2 ahistorical cards, which vary things up a bit and allow for some exploration of some alternative histories. The armistice itself was very limited in scope. There were only a few different topics that were decided in the armistice. The 4 we chose to focus on were POWs, prisoners of war, and the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone, supervision of the area after the war, and introduction of arms and arms control post-armistice. And so each of these nations will have, after they draw one of these cards, their objectives and what victory looks like in terms of the victory points they would gain at the end of the game. Next slide, please. So looking at the game as a whole, we have the game board here. Those 4 issues are debated through rounds of bidding. And so with 4 issues, there will be 4 rounds, but the agenda, the order in which the issues are bid on, isn't set at the beginning of the game. The players have to do a first round, an agenda setting round of bidding, to determine which issues come up first in the negotiations and which come up last. As the game progresses, on round 1, the first issue will be debated, so pretend POWs. On round 2, both the second and the first issue will be debated, and so on. So the effect of that is the first issue will be bid on 4 times across 4 rounds, whereas the last issue would only be bid on once on the 4th round. The global events are cards that will affect the bidding mechanics. So these can change the way that nations are forced to bid or add limitations to them to make the process a little more interesting, and those have historical bases that Sam will get to in a bit. Next slide, please. This is just a diagram of the game schema. We tried, because of the limitations in the class, to keep the decision space for players pretty small, but meaningful. So the areas in which a player has agency is really what they're bidding, and that is influenced by two major things. One is their war posture. At the end, or at the beginning of every turn, every nation may set their war posture, which involves some amount of risk and a reward that will add to the pool of resources they're able to bid with. And we'll get into that in a bit. Domestic crises are the risk you're taking by increasing your war posture to something more aggressive. So the more aggressive you may be, the more likely it is you'll have to draw and resolve a domestic crisis, which will reduce your resources. So there's a bit of a push your luck mechanic going on here to try to moderate power and risk and reduce some of the snowballing, that kind of thing. Once players have ascertained exactly how much leverage they'll have after they've received their base, changed it by their war posture, and perhaps encountered a crisis, they'll then bid in rounds on the issues that we talked about earlier. And that's, of course, where the opposing team can bid and then your ally can bid. The way we set up the team dynamic is that the UN and the Republic of Korea bid together as a team against the People's Republic of China and DPRK, and the result of those two influences which way the issue tracks move, which influences the final outcome and final scoring. Next slide, please.
So a note about how we tried to model history within the game. We, as a war game, obviously it cannot follow history to a T. That wouldn't be a game. That'd be watching a documentary of the Korean War Armistice. And so we needed to create space for player agency. And also to make the game a bit more interesting. So somebody that knows how the Korean War played out is not going to have necessarily an advantage over somebody that had no idea how the Korean War played out. As this is an educational game. So we kept the historical elements to the terms available to the parties. Sorry, as in the terms available in the actual armistice itself. This was because the United States negotiators had a very discrete set of terms that they were willing to negotiate. This is an armistice agreement. This is not a peace treaty. And so they only wanted to negotiate issues pertinent to the military situation. That's why we're talking about prisoners of war, the DMZ, or the line of demarcation, the demilitarized zone, all kind of similar terms, the supervision of the armistice, and the introduction of arms. These are all, as McLean spoke about earlier, these are all kind of military concerns. We did not go into actual land transfer or what government's legitimate, because those are political terms, not military. We also then maintained the fact that an armistice agreement was going to be reached, and a peace treaty was not. We toyed around early in development with having almost like a two-stage game, where you negotiate an armistice and then maybe negotiate a peace treaty. But that, we felt, was not actually emblematic of history. In the Geneva Accords, when that you might know this from in the aftermath of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. The Geneva Accords are what created North and South Vietnam. They also were supposed to negotiate the peace treaty for the Korean War. But when the Zhou Enlai and the Chinese foreign minister and some other North Korean and Chinese diplomats approached the American negotiators saying, hey, are we supposed to do a peace treaty? Essentially, the Americans were like, oh, no, we're not doing that. They ignored them. And so we felt that it wouldn't be accurate to say that there was almost any world where the US wanted a peace treaty, because they wanted an armistice to end the war, but they wanted to be able to keep the military, in that region just as a check on China and the USSR. We also wanted to maintain the fact that this is a limited war. China was in the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War, and the United States is in the aftermath of World War II. And nobody had an appetite for an all-out war, U.S. v. China, So we were keeping this limited to Korea, and that also plays into the fact that this is a game about the Korean Armistice, and we wanted a game about the Korean Armistice. We didn't want a game about the explosion of the Korean War into something more major. On the ahistorical side, this is a very traditional order of events. Like the global events are going to be shuffled in a deck because it's a deck of cards. That's a very traditional war game thing to do, so we figured it'd be fine. Domestic crises are a kind of unique thing that's not necessarily historical, but we tried to lean historical as much as possible in creating them. So the North Korean and Chinese economies were really struggling to support the war throughout much of the conflict, regardless of what the Politburos of either country were saying. And so we had some domestic crises to, again, moderate how much power players could gain, of saying, hey, Chinese player, your economy's struggling. You have you don't have as much leverage in these negotiations. On the American side, we have it wasn't quite as bad as Vietnam, but there were peace protests towards the end of the Korean War, and so we have some crises where it's like, oh, there are peace protests across the United States. The United States representing the United Nations, because it was by and large a United States military operation. But we also wanted to stick to history and say it's the United Nations. And so the domestic crises and then also are saying, U.S. The opposition party, we aren't going to name necessarily who it is, because we don't want to go that historical necessarily. Sweeps in the midterms because people are upset about how the war is going. So that's kind of how we're modeling domestic crises a little bit. We also are changing the national priorities just to change up the game, so it's not the same game every time. We want players to have also some uncertainty about what the priorities of a given player are. So if I'm the United Nations player, I don't want to necessarily know exactly what the PRC player wants, because that's not an interesting game. So we put some uncertainty into that by creating these ahistorical situations. Lastly, I have a whole section on how we're modeling time in this game. So that's in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So the way we're modeling time in this game, I feel, maybe I'm biased because I helped make it. I feel like it's a pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting. So in the actual peace negotiations, there are two main things that we brought to the modeling of time. There is the agenda round, and there are the multiple rounds of negotiations. In the actual armistice, there was a lot of fighting over the agenda items. The PRC and the DPRK negotiators kept trying to negotiate things that the United States is like, that's not a military matter. I'm sorry, we're not going to talk about that. But they kept pushing because they thought the United States was just trying to subvert the negotiations, and it got as so bad that Joseph Stalin actually told Mao Zedong and Kim Il Sung that it was essentially, "Hey guys, the Americans aren't trying to pull one over on you. That's just how Western diplomacy kind of works." And so we wanted to model that in the game. And so that's why we have that agenda round where people are bidding to actually set the order of what issue of the issues. The other thing that was notable for the Korean armistice negotiations was the many rounds of negotiations. The negotiations were constantly on again, off again, on again. And so we thought this teased nicely into the agenda round by having these rounds actually represent potentially rounds of negotiation. So that's why we have, this round of negotiation is issue 1, and the next one is issue 1 and 2, because theoretically you've proceeded a bit further in the negotiation because it's another round of negotiations. So that's kind of how we're modeling time on a broad scale. The only other thing I want to mention on the actual structure of the rounds are the global events, which I'll touch on in a little bit as well. The global events are kind of representing the passage of time between rounds of negotiation. And so we, at the beginning of a round, you'll roll a die to determine how many global events you're drawing. And so that is kind of a pseudo representation of the passage of time between the actual rounds of negotiation to make it really feel like time has passed since you last negotiated the armistice. Next slide, please. And now let's talk about those global events. So these events I wanted, there were a couple things that we wanted to focus on with these global events. They're wanted, obviously, to keep these historical, if not the order of them happening is historical. And so these all these global events are things that happened in the process of the Korean War. For example, on this slide, we have the China rebukes the Treaty of San Francisco and Douglas MacArthur relieved from duty. In the actual Korean War, Douglas MacArthur was relieved from duty because he threatened to nuke the People's Republic of China and also publicly disagreed with the President of the United States, his boss, and you can't necessarily do that. And so he was fired, and that created a little bit of command discontinuity. And so the effect of the card is that the US has to spend all their leverage because there's a new commander, and that is going, and they very publicly have had a disruption in their command, so they essentially lose all the leverage at the end of the round, rather than retaining any to the next round. For the China rebukes the Treaty of San Francisco event, in the Korean War saw signing of the Treaty of San Francisco, which ended the World War II in the Pacific. Importantly, the PRC and the CCP were not included in those negotiations. And that was a huge issue for China, because as you can imagine, the PRC might feel like they have the right to participate in those negotiations, given that they waged a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese in China. But in that event tees into another thing about the armistice, which is kind of fun, is that the negotiators on the communist side were very infamous for going on super long rants about Marxism and imperialism. And so we're just literal hours on end ranting about that. And so thematically, this card is that they're not included in the Treaty of San Francisco. So their negotiators just go on an hours-long rant about Marxism and the United States' empire in the Pacific, as they would say. And so they get to bid a little bit extra at the end of the round as they're tiring everybody out. Speaking of the effects of these cards, I, in the design process for this game, was reading a lot of design diaries for Oath New Foundations, Cole Wehrle's expansion to his game Oath. And he wrote a lot about how he wanted to focus on making the effects of Oath chunky. These big effects that, are very visible to the game, rather than having a bunch of small effects stack up on each other to some big conclusion. He just wanted, a big effect that has a very visible impact. And I was inspired in by that and creating the effects for these cards. And so they have these massive effects where the United States the UN player has to spend all of their leverage. They can't retain any to the next round. The PRC player gets to bid after seeing the UN bid. So that was a focus for the design of these. The last thing I want to note on the global events, I could speak for a while on these, so I'll limit myself a little bit, is the addition of leverage retention. We were toying with ways to carry leverage between rounds for a while. For several playtests, we had just lose half of your leverage, but we felt that wasn't extremely interesting. It has a little bit mathy, maybe not necessarily most clear to players who were not war gamers or not board gamers that are experienced with having their resources. And so we added these leverage retention numbers in the top left in orange, as you that you can see in the slide here. And that is further modeling the passage of time. So if you, with shorter events having shorter leverage retention numbers, and kind of distributing it evenly, but as best as we could, trying to match the larger numbers to longer events. So, next slide, please.
So now looking at the bidding system that we designed, bidding is done between the 4 players blind. So every player receives a screen to portion out their bid that then we reveal in stages. So across each of the rounds, there are multiple issues being bid on. So for instance, round 3, there would be 3 issues bid on in sequence. For each of those, players portion out what they want to bid of the leverage that they have access to after going through the global events and other modifications. And then they reveal them in stages. So first the 2 Koreas reveal, and then the 2 larger powers, UN and PRC, reveal their bids. The 2 teams' bids are combined together and then compared. And the winner of that is who gets to move their issue track towards the side gaining them more victory points. We changed this system a little bit through our design, but this was really the core mechanic that we were trying to design around. So one of the reasons for the 2-stage system is just to reflect the power imbalance between the Koreas, but then their larger kind of patrons in the conflict. Another thing that we changed was the use of the term leverage. Originally, we had it as influence when we were trying to focus very heavily on this being negotiation, but the further we dug into the history, the more we realized that this was, a very limited agreement, right? The Armistice, as Sam went through, was limited to just a few conditions, and so we wanted to reflect that as it's more, how much leverage can I bring to the negotiating table? So we changed that name. The Leverage itself, of course, is limited. It's limited by what you decide your war posture is, which I'll get to next, but also what happens in global events. And so that's adds a bit of resource allocation considerations. Do you carry over leverage, right, with the retention mechanic on the global event cards to add some decision space? And as it's blind, you don't necessarily know what your opponents or even your ally can do. During the bidding, the players on the same team can talk to each other and perhaps scheme a little bit on what they think they should bid. But again, there's a dynamic of, well, the Korean player is going to bid first. Everyone will see those bids, and then the PRC and UN will bid, as well as competing priorities even amongst the same team through the priority cards. And that's where that competitive cooperation comes in. And so only one player can win at the end. Next slide, please. So I've talked a lot about war posture already, but this is an example of a player mat. So each player has one of these, and the risk management and push your luck mechanics are really embodied in this war posture system. So there are 4 levels to it. Static, you have no chance of a crisis, but you also do not get any extra leverage to bring to the table when you start bidding for that round. Similarly, that ratchets up by 25% in terms of crisis chance to 25, 50, and 75. And then a commensurate increase in how much leverage you gain every turn. So 2, 4, or 6. Players every round can choose to move this however they want, and they do that hidden. And then they all reveal it. And after that is when they roll for a domestic crisis. Originally, how we had this working was a military power disk system. So this was another resource that we had in the game, and we used it both to determine the risk that you would incur with your deployment, but also how much leverage you'd gain as a base. This proved a little confusing to players and added a lot of math into the game that we didn't necessarily like. So we decided to simplify it and omit it and go to this war posture system to try to get away from public math, fiddly bits, that kind of thing. The other thing this adds is a gradual sort of escalation. As the rounds go on, we found that players through the play testing often ratcheted up their war posture, trying to get more leverage, particularly because as the game goes on, you're bidding on more and more issues. So the basic leverage that you have is spread thinner and thinner, and so there's kind of more demand, but also risk as time goes on.
Sorry, McLean. Really quick, one thing on the military power discs is that we were inspired by a couple of other peace games, namely peace negotiation games, namely Churchill and Versailles 1919, on some of these mechanics, and more so Versailles 1919 because it had this very different the negotiating on each issue and kind of a little bit of bidding, but the military power discs were really drawn very much from Versailles 1919, but we realized in that Versailles 1919 has several things where you're like deploying military power to a given region to get more leverage there or more victory points there, but it tires out your country and it exposes you to more risk in losing victory points. And so that general idea is what we ported over for this military power discs system. But as McLean said, was a little too fiddly because, and most likely because Versailles 1919 players are expecting fiddly or at the very least complicated, and players for a 2-hour learnable and playable in 2 hours game are not looking for that kind of calculation.
last thing I will add on this is that to reflect the difference in power between the teams and within the teams, the two Koreas every turn start out with 10 leverage as opposed to the UN and China's 12, just to kind of work in the imbalance in power there. However, there are differences in the global event cards, which kinds of balances that out a little bit, as well as the crisis cards, which I'll talk about next. So next slide, please. So these are examples of the crisis cards. The crisis cards we came up with as an idea to regulate, the risk and power, have a push your luck system here. But they also interact with global events and to an extent have some kind of general and then national flavors to them. So each nation has 4 of these cards. So it's possible in theory to hit 4 across all 4 rounds of the game. 2 of these are usually kind of more generic. Green troops cause military disaster in this instance. And then there are usually 2 with kind of more specific, more flavorful, tied to the country in question. So in this case, Mao questions military leadership. Anatomy-wise for these cards, they have a plain lose leverage effect, and then they also have a choice for the player to make. So this is, again, a place where players have a decision. So these effects either alter your ability to change your war posture, reflecting some limitations on the domestic side to exert more force, or they defer. You can choose to defer risk here and make it more likely for you to incur a crisis the next turn as well. And then there are some other mechanics that change the way that your maximum or minimum bid, it might impose one of those on you. One thing we ran into during the playtesting, of course, is if it's the last round, these decisions may or may not be meaningful. And so in that instance, we had to add a round 4 effect in the event that someone ran into one of these domestic crises on round 4, there needed to be something extra besides a choice, which may not have an effect without a next round. Next slide, please.
So in our final playtest, there were a couple different ideas for changes to the game that we thought seemed rather meaningful and particularly fruitful or interesting. We've also had a perennial problem with one of them, if we're being honest. So the first one is the idea of a variable ending. So currently our game, it's the agenda round and then 4 rounds of negotiation. That you know when the game is going to end, and so you can kind of plan around that. And so the playtesters suggested the idea of a variable ending. And specifically, we, in conversation with us, we developed this idea of almost a leverage spend threshold to end the game, where there's another thing to bid on at the end of every round of bidding, where players can pitch in leverage that they haven't spent or didn't want to spend, and eventually that it's like a track or a scale of some sorts that will accumulate more and more leverage. And once it hits a threshold, the peace treaty or the armistice will conclude. And this is kind of representing the negotiators finally going, well, this is good enough for us. I don't think we're necessarily going to get any new points being made, so we can accept these terms as they are. And so that creates some different player incentives around war posture and leverage spending that could be pretty interesting. and we would like to pursue that further. But given that the final is shortly before Christmas, we haven't actually had time to necessarily explore that. Then the kind of perennial problem we've been having is moving away from math. So the game as it stands is, there's a war posture that is public, and there is a base leverage game that is public, and there are public bids. So if you wanted to, you could know, oh, okay, well, the UN player is gaining 16 leverage a turn, 12 base, and 4 from their war posture. They spent 12 of it, and they can retain 4 of it. So they can retain 4 of it to the next round. And the next round, they gain another 16 leverage or something like that. And so now I know they have 20 leverage. So I can determine, if I wanted to, what they will bid, what they could possibly bid on each issue. And then there are players that don't want to do that because that's a lot of math to do in a game that's trying to focus on the dynamics of a negotiation. And so the game as it stands kind of gives a little bit of a bonus to people that are willing to do those calculations. And so we have a couple ideas on changing that to make the information a little less public, but we're struggling a little bit because the ideas are maybe making the domestic crises hidden, but then it's not fun because you're just privately resolving a card on a table of 4 people that is just kind of sitting there waiting for you to resolve a card. Or you could read the title of the domestic crisis, but then players that know what the domestic crises are, that have played before, know how much leverage you're losing anyway. And so now experienced players have a benefit over new players. And so the problem isn't fundamentally solved. There's an idea to introduce some randomness into the domestic crises. And since they're already kind of an interrupt to the game, maybe it's okay, but is that too fiddly? At the end of the day, it'll just take some more thinking on how to solve this problem, and it fully might just be a problem with these kinds of bidding games. But we think the core of this game is very fun. We've had very engaging play tests where somebody dramatically reveals a 0 bid as their partner bid 10 leverage on an issue. And so and stuff like that. So it's a very fun game when you get into the real drama of the negotiation and those team dynamics. And so, really moving away from the math is important to us. And I'm sure there is a solution out there. So anyway, thank you for listening to our presentation on a bid for peace. It was a lot of fun putting together over the course of a semester. It was a lot of work, but one of the most fruitful experiences of my life, designing a game purely from scratch, and now presenting it here was a very fun experience.
All right. Thanks, McLean and Sam. We do have some time for questions. And before I start reading the questions off, however, I will make an observation that I am continually surprised and pleased by the initiative that you folks at the Georgetown University Wargame Society put into these games that come out of that program. So this looks fascinating, and I would totally play it. Let's start with a question from Brant, who has managed to obscure everybody's faces with his gigantic head. He might have missed it, but did you include any global events that could have happened but didn't happen historically? For example, Russian intervention or naval blockades?
We did not necessarily, kind of, I guess, is the answer. So we had some global events that say the PRC is frustrated with Soviet aid, or the Kim Il-sung is frustrated with Chinese leadership. And these things were true, but they didn't explode into the public eye like they might in this game. But so in a sense, kind of, because there are events that were not necessarily global events that happen in the game, but we didn't really stray into alternate history paths of naval blockades or Russian intervention, because we wanted to keep the game to things that happened within the Korean, like actually happened in the Korean War, but just kind of mixing up the order of those.
I'll just add that it just kind of reflected the tension of the class design too. Like, this is supposed to be an educational game with a pretty healthy amount of research behind it historically. And so those very discrete events were something that we just decided to stray much closer to real life on, and then try to work in other ways for players to pursue a historical outcomes, especially with those priority cards and scoring system like that.
Cool. Here's another question from somebody called Ardwulf's Lair, who's probably some bumpkin from Ohio, who asks, how does the design and development of an educational war game differ from an analytic or commercial war game? Obviously, from your perspectives.
McLean, do you want to lead this one up?
Yeah. So that's part of, the first section of this course was teaching us the difference between these and scoping things in for our own designs. Educational games primarily are trying to get the players to understand something, educate them about either a historical event or a certain decision process, or certain trade-offs that people in different positions than their own may have to make, especially in like a war game, right? Like, if you're trying to balance between resources, something like that, teaching people how to do that, or what might they expect. Analytical games are aimed at collecting data from the participants in the room. You gather together a group of experts to play an analytical war game to try to get at their thought processes, or bring their expertise into the room in contact with others to try to get at maybe some outcomes that you might not expect as a learning tool, and then end with a final analytical product looking at the decision making from all of those folks, and seeing what you can glean from that to maybe influence policy or just decision making. Commercial games are, in my view, much closer to educational games very often, right? And we played a lot of commercial games in the lead up to making our own here, to try to look at mechanics that we might, take or use or be inspired by, and to try to get a better handle on what kind of scope we needed to focus on for our game. It's fairly limited as compared to some of the big war games out there.
Another element on analytical games I just want to mention is, if you've ever heard of like the Center for Naval Analysis, or like IDA, the Institute for Defense Analysis, even I forget exactly, but they are running analytical games. So if you've heard of war games running a simulation of an invasion of Taiwan, probably an analytical game, because they're trying to, they're running it for the military, so the military can learn something about the thing that they are preparing for.
Okay, and we've got another one from Brant, who asks, was there anything that you changed as a result of playtesting that just didn't work, so you changed it back? Or what's a change you tried and introduced that just didn't work out, if any?
Sorry. Trying to think here. I think we were very lucky to have Professor Olson take help us out a lot in the playtesting and development cycle. So many of our changes we would pass by him first, because we would have a playtest and then talk to him after class about the problems we encountered and our solutions. And so through that dialogue, we were able to iron out a lot of the rough edges kind of before they came up in the playtest. As some, because we were able to talk to somebody that's not as actively involved in the development, can offer an unbiased perspective, and obviously somebody who's a wargaming expert. And so nothing off the top of my head, but McLean might have some insight on that end. So.
I think the closest thing to that we had to go through multiple iterations of, and did go back and forth a bit, was the retention mechanic for leverage. So at the end of a round, if you hadn't spent all your resources, would they stay? Would you be able to use them next round? Would there be an attrition? And between the play tests, I think we changed it almost every time before we settled on having the retention numbers listed on the global events, which was definitely a more elegant design. But yeah, that is a system that went through multiple iterations, almost back and forth between, do we have something that tells you explicitly how much you can retain across rounds, or do we have a system that randomizes it a little bit, or has a have it and round up or down sort of thing?
Okay. We do have one more from Brant, who asks, thinking of the class as a whole, was there something that you learned during the course that was a big surprise or revelation to you? I think you should each answer this.
On my end, I think it was my biggest surprise was how much it didn't seem like work, I guess, to design a game. As somebody who is an extremely avid board gamer, I was looking forward to designing a game, but I felt that, oh man, this is going to be tough, because it's a whole game in 4 months. I'm already doing a credit overload, but I found myself just in my free time or avoiding other work, just working on this game, because it was so fun to see something that we created actually come to life and be fun to play. So that might be my biggest surprise, how much it didn't seem like we were putting in as much work as we were.
McLean?
I would say it surprised me how quickly complexity can get away from you, and how important scoping the game was at the beginning. I think one thing we did very well was deciding what our core mechanic was, what our core theme was, and then only branching that out to the extent that it was something that we could manage to produce by the end of the semester. I think that I have a much greater respect now for games that are massive in scope and have, countless mechanics. Writing our rule book was incredibly instructive for that. Having to go through every aspect of the game and really put into writing exactly how you do that unambiguously, that was, I learned a lot from that. So I wasn't anticipating that to be one of the biggest pieces of learning I came away from but it was.
So Brant's got one more. Also thinking of the class, what is something that you're going to take with you from this class into future courses or careers later on?
McLean, do you want to?
I think that this has given me a pretty healthy appreciation for actually using gaming as an educational tool. Playing through all the different things that we did through the semester, designing our own, but again, aimed at educating, was really interesting and really engaging, right? It's not just I'm reading a book and learning about something. It's not I'm listening to a lecture and learning about something. It's I'm more doing something. So it gave me a big appreciation for wargaming in general and the abstract as a learning tool. And so I hope that I'll be able to use that later in my career. If I'm ever teaching something, And then in terms of future courses, yeah, it'd be great to come up with a opportunity for a class to use a game to illustrate something. So yeah, definitely going to try to use it in the future.
Sam?
My kind of two things that I can think of, two of the biggest things that I can't choose between for this, for the answer for this question is, one, McLean already kind of touched on it, is scoping. It is, I think, so vitally important to scope everything you're doing before you do it. Like, and this is for so much of my school life, projects are scoped for you. You're given the instructions for the project, and this is exactly the deliverable that that your teacher or professor wants. But having to scope the project ourselves was, and frankly, I think doing it rather successfully from from shortly after the outset was an invaluable lesson on the importance of that process, and having these discussions very early on of what the deliverable should look like, what are we going to be doing, how should we break down the work. It was I think one of the best examples of that kind of project that I've ever worked on or ever had the chance to work on. And the other thing is the importance of close coordination between stuff. We all successfully kind of had our own niches in the game, and though we almost operated like a well-oiled machine in that in a regard of people doing their job and like knowing what to do and communicating the expectations. So I they kind of are related in that it's about how to operate as a project, but I think that is the best teaching moment from this class.
Interestingly, neither of you mentioned the vast wealth that will accrue to you now that you are wargame designers. That's very strange to me. So, folks, I think we have reached our conclusion here. I would like to thank McLean and Sam for stopping by. They have a very interesting looking game on the Armistice for the Korean conflict that we should. Are you guys planning to perhaps pitch this to a commercial publisher?
I think it would. I'd be willing to put out some feelers. McLean and I talked about it a couple days ago.
Cool. If so, or if I happen to be at an event with one of you guys and you have the game with you, I would be delighted to play this. So thanks once again for a marvelous presentation, and thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.